Sometimes the richest person in the room is the one nobody bothers looking at. Rain slid down the tall glass windows of the Velvet Note in silver streaks as soft jazz floated through the restaurant like smoke. Manhattan glittered outside, cold and distant, but inside the lighting was warm enough to make expensive people forget their empty lives for a few hours. Audrey Hale moved quietly between tables with a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her black uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. She didn't rush. She never did. At 28, Audrey had mastered the art of becoming invisible to wealthy men. They noticed the wine, the marble floors, the crystal glasses, but not the waitress refilling their bourbon before they asked. "Table 12 wants another bottle," whispered Mia near the service station. "And be careful, that's Julian Mercer." Audrey glanced toward the corner booth without reacting. Julian Mercer sat beneath the amber chandelier like he owned the building, which technically, through 3 shell corporations, he probably did. 40 years old, founder of Mercer Digital Bank, worth somewhere around $11 billion, depending on which magazine was estimating. His charcoal suit looked perfectly tailored. His silver watch caught the light every time he lifted his whiskey glass. Men at his table laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny. Investors. Men who measured human value in percentages. Audrey picked up a fresh bottle of bourbon and walked toward the table. "Gentlemen," she said softly. Julian barely looked at her. "You're late." 7 minutes, sir," Audrey replied calmly while pouring the drink with steady hands. One investor smirked. That watch probably costs more than her yearly salary. A few chuckled into their glasses. Audrey said nothing. Julian finally looked up then, studying her face for the first time. Most servers reacted to rooms like this with nervous smiles or forced laughter. She didn't. Her blue eyes stayed calm, almost detached. It irritated him more than it should have. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. "Audrey. Just Audrey. That's usually enough." One of the men laughed harder this time. Julian leaned back slowly, curiosity flickering behind his cold expression. "You always answer questions like that?" Audrey placed the bottle down gently. "Only the unnecessary ones." Silence brushed across the table for half a second. One investor nearly choked on his drink, trying not to laugh. Julian's jaw tightened slightly, though his face never fully changed. Audrey turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Wait." She paused beside the table as rain tapped softly against the windows behind her. Julian reached into his jacket and slid a black metal card across the white tablecloth. "Check my balance," he said casually, loud enough for the others to hear. A few men exchanged amused looks immediately. Audrey glanced at the card, then at him. She understood the game instantly. Wealthy men like Julian Mercer enjoyed testing people the same way boys poked at insects with sticks. To him, humiliation was entertainment dressed as confidence. "Sir," one investor grinned, "you're going to scare the poor girl." Julian kept his eyes on Audrey, waiting for discomfort, waiting for panic, waiting for her to remember her place. Instead, Audrey picked up the card carefully between 2 fingers and studied the engraved initials beneath the dim restaurant lights. Then, very slowly, she smiled. Not warmly, not nervously, just enough to make Julian Mercer feel something unfamiliar crawl quietly down his spine. Julian Mercer had spent 20 years building an empire powerful enough to make senators return his calls within minutes. Yet somehow the quiet blonde waitress standing beside his table made him feel like he was the one being evaluated. Audrey turned the black card slowly between her fingers while the chandelier light reflected against the polished metal surface. Around the table, the investors waited for her to stumble. That was how these games usually ended. A nervous laugh, a trembling apology, maybe a manager rushing over to smooth things out before the billionaire became annoyed. But Audrey did not move like someone afraid of losing her job. She looked at the card for another second, then calmly reached for the phone resting beside Julian's whiskey glass. "Careful, one," investor said with a grin. "That card probably has a higher limit than this entire building." Another laughed. "Probably more than her apartment, too." Julian stayed silent. Watching, Audrey pressed a number from memory. Not customer service. Not the number printed on the back of the card. Something else. Her voice remained soft as she spoke into the receiver. "Private Wealth Division, please." The laughter around the table faded slightly. A woman answered almost immediately. "Mercer International Priority Line. How may we assist you?" Audrey glanced once at the black card before speaking again. I need account verification. Julian leaned back slowly, amused again now. You know how many people would kill for access to that number? Audrey ignored him completely. Then the automated security system interrupted the call. Voice recognition in progress. One investor smirked into his bourbon. This should be entertaining. The soft electronic tone continued for 3 seconds that suddenly felt much longer. Then the system spoke again. Identity mismatch detected. A few men chuckled under their breath. But before Julian could say anything, the voice calmly added, "This device is already linked to Audrey Hale. Welcome back, Ms. Hale." Silence. Real silence this time. Not social silence. Not awkward silence. The kind that changes the temperature in a room. Julian's fingers stopped tapping his glass. Audrey's expression did not change at all. Outside, yellow taxi lights slid across the rain-soaked streets below Manhattan like drifting gold. The voice on the line continued politely. "Would you like us to notify Zurich regarding the transfer exceeding $800 million? One investor nearly dropped his drink. Another slowly lowered his fork onto the plate without making a sound. Julian stared at Audrey as if his brain could not fully process what he had just heard. She ended the call gently and placed the phone beside his untouched whiskey. "Your balance is perfectly fine, sir," she said quietly. Nobody laughed this time. Audrey stepped back from the table with calm professionalism, smoothing one sleeve of her uniform as though nothing unusual had happened. Julian finally found his voice. "Who are you?" Audrey looked at him directly for the first time that night. Her blue eyes reflected the city lights behind him. Cold. Intelligent. Tired in a way expensive people never understood. "Someone your world stopped looking for a long time ago," she said softly. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen while the entire table watched her leave in complete silence. Julian Mercer remained frozen beneath the chandelier, staring at the doorway she disappeared through, while one thought repeated itself louder and louder inside his head. $800 million did not belong to waitresses. The moment Audrey disappeared behind the kitchen doors, the entire atmosphere inside the Velvet Note changed. Conversations returned slowly, uncertain at first, like people waking from the same strange dream. One investor cleared his throat and forced a laugh. Well, that was unexpected. Nobody joined him. Julian Mercer kept staring at the empty doorway where Audrey had vanished. The amber light above the table reflected faintly in his untouched whiskey, but his mind was no longer in the restaurant. $800 million. Zurich. Private wealth verification linked directly to her voice. None of it made sense. He had spent his entire life studying people, predicting them, controlling rooms before anyone realized they were being controlled. Yet somehow he had completely misread the quiet waitress carrying bourbon through a jazz restaurant on a rainy Thursday night. "Julian," one investor finally said carefully. "Who exactly is she?" Julian did not answer immediately. Outside the windows, rain washed silver across Lexington Avenue, while yellow cabs drifted through the city below. Somewhere near the piano, a glass shattered softly, making several people flinch harder than they should have. "I do not know," Julian admitted at last. The words sounded foreign coming from him. Men like Julian Mercer were not supposed to say, "I do not know." One of the younger investors leaned closer. "Maybe she married rich." Another shook his head immediately. "No chance. Did you see her face when Zurich was mentioned? That was not surprise. That was routine." Julian's jaw tightened slightly. He hated that they were right. Audrey had not acted impressed by wealth because wealth had clearly stopped impressing her a very long time ago. The waitress station remained visible from the corner booth. Julian watched Audrey quietly refill water glasses at another table as if nothing unusual had happened. Her posture stayed relaxed. Her movements precise. She did not glance toward his table once. That bothered him more than the humiliation itself. Most people reacted to powerful men in predictable ways. Fear, excitement, desperation. Audrey Hale reacted with distance. Cold distance. "Sir?" His assistant Daniel appeared beside the table holding a tablet against his chest. "Your driver is waiting downstairs." Julian barely looked at him. "Cancel the rest of tomorrow morning." Daniel blinked. "You have the Zurich conference call at 8. Cancel it." His tone left no room for discussion. Daniel nodded carefully and stepped away. Across the room, Audrey carried a tray toward an elderly couple seated near the window. The older man struggled slightly, opening a small medicine bottle with trembling hands. Audrey noticed immediately. She set the tray down first, then gently opened the cap for him without making the moment embarrassing. The old woman smiled at her with quiet gratitude. Audrey smiled back. Small. Genuine. Julian noticed something then that unsettled him even more than the bank call. Audrey treated the elderly couple with exactly the same calm respect she had shown him after discovering he was worth billions. No difference. No performance. No shift in tone. She did not care who mattered in the room because, somehow, she had already decided for herself what mattered. Julian slowly stood from the table, adjusting the sleeve of his charcoal jacket. The investors watched him carefully now. Curious. Nervous. Where are you going? Someone asked. Julian's eyes stayed fixed on Audrey across the restaurant. To find out why a woman connected to an $800 million Zurich account is serving bourbon in Midtown for $23 an hour. And for the first time in years, Julian Mercer felt something unfamiliar pulling him forward. Not attraction. Not pride. Curiosity. Real curiosity. The dangerous kind. Julian Mercer did not usually chase answers personally. That was what assistants, analysts, and private investigators were for. But 20 minutes after Audrey Hale walked away from his table, he found himself standing near the service hallway watching her stack clean glasses beneath warm yellow lights, while rain whispered softly against the windows outside. The restaurant had grown quieter now. Midnight approached. Investors had started leaving one by one, their polished shoes clicking across marble floors as they disappeared into waiting black SUVs. Audrey barely seemed to notice any of it. She moved carefully through the closing routine with the same calm precision she had shown during the bank call. No rush. No nerves. Almost as if the entire evening had meant nothing to her. Julian slipped his hands into the pockets of his charcoal coat and walked toward the service station. Several employees straightened immediately when they recognized him. Wealth still had that effect on people. Fear disguised as respect. Audrey continued wiping down the counter without looking up. The kitchen closes in 15 minutes, she said quietly. If you need dessert, I can ask them to stay open. Julian stopped across from her. I am not here for dessert. Most billionaires are not. The corner of his mouth tightened slightly. Again, no fear. No effort to impress him. Just that same maddening calm. Audrey finally looked up from the stack of glasses in front of her. Did your investors survive the trauma of hearing somebody else has money? Julian almost laughed despite himself. Almost. Who are you really? He asked instead. Audrey folded the towel neatly beside the sink. A waitress. No, his voice lowered. A waitress does not have direct access to Zurich private banking. And a billionaire should know better than to judge people by uniforms. The words landed softly. That made them worse somehow. Julian studied her face beneath the warm restaurant lights. She looked tired now. Not physically tired. Something deeper. The kind of exhaustion expensive vacations could never fix. $800 million, he said carefully. People do not just accidentally end up with that kind of money. Audrey picked up another glass. Neither do billionaires. Silence stretched between them while somewhere in the distance a piano played the final slow notes of an old jazz song. Julian noticed then that her hands were steady. Completely steady. No shaking. No performance. Most people became nervous standing this close to someone who controlled banks, markets, entire industries. Audrey Hale looked more comfortable carrying dirty glasses than wealthy men looked carrying power. You know who I am, Julian said. Everyone in Manhattan knows who you are. Then you also know I can find answers. Audrey's eyes returned to his calmly. That sounds less like confidence and more like a threat. Julian exhaled slowly through his nose. She had a way of forcing honesty out of him without even trying. Fine, he admitted quietly. Curiosity. Audrey considered him for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she asked, do you know what the difference is between rich people and wealthy people? Julian frowned slightly. There is a difference. Rich people want to be seen, Audrey said softly. Wealthy people want privacy. Outside, thunder rolled low across the Manhattan skyline. Julian felt something shift subtly inside his chest at those words. Because for the first time all night, Audrey did not sound defensive. She sounded experienced, as if she understood wealth from the inside out. Then the restaurant manager suddenly rushed toward them holding a tablet, his face pale. Audrey, he whispered urgently. There is a problem with Table 7's payment system. Audrey glanced toward the dining room immediately. Julian followed her gaze. An elderly man stood near the register looking embarrassed while his wife searched nervously through her purse. Audrey set the glass down at once and walked past Julian without hesitation. But before she reached the couple, the manager quietly muttered something under his breath that made Julian's entire expression harden. Figures, the man whispered. People who cannot afford dinner always cause trouble. Audrey stopped. Walking instantly. Audrey stopped so suddenly the room itself seemed to pause with her. The manager shifted uncomfortably beneath her gaze, suddenly aware Julian Mercer was standing only a few feet away listening to every word. The elderly couple near the register looked exhausted more than embarrassed. The man held an old leather wallet in trembling hands while his wife searched through receipts with quiet panic. Rain tapped gently against the windows behind them, soft and steady like a clock counting down the silence. Audrey walked toward the couple without hurry. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Is there a problem with the payment terminal?" The older man looked relieved someone had spoken to him kindly. "I think my card froze again," he admitted softly. "I told Margaret we should not have come into the city during the storm." His wife touched his arm immediately. "Howard, please." Audrey smiled gently. "You came for dinner, not a financial interrogation. Let us fix it." The manager forced a tight smile beside her. "Sir, if the card is declined, company policy says we need another form of payment." Audrey glanced at him calmly. "Then we will find another solution." Julian watched from several feet away, silent now. Something about the scene unsettled him in a way billion-dollar negotiations never did. Audrey crouched slightly beside the elderly woman so they were eye level. "Mrs. Margaret, did your bank recently replace your card?" The woman blinked in surprise. "Yes, last month." "Then the fraud protection system probably flagged tonight's transaction because you usually spend closer to home." Audrey held out her hand gently. "May I?" The woman nodded and passed over the card. Audrey studied it for barely 2 seconds before walking behind the register. Her fingers moved quickly across the payment screen while the manager hovered nervously nearby. "How did you know that?" he whispered. Audrey did not look up. "Because banks panic when people over 70 suddenly spend money in Manhattan after 6 months of grocery store purchases in Connecticut." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. Again, she spoke about financial systems the way chefs spoke about recipes. Calm. Familiar. Audrey pressed one final button and handed the card back to the elderly man with a small smile. "Try now." The machine beeped softly. "Approved." Margaret let out a relieved breath, while Howard laughed quietly under his breath. "Well," he said, "you just saved date night." Audrey smiled. Good marriages deserve second chances. The old woman reached out suddenly and squeezed Audrey's hand. "You are very kind, sweetheart." Audrey's expression softened for the first time all evening. Real softness, not the controlled calm she wore around wealthy men. "Safe drive home," she said quietly. "Roads are slippery tonight." The couple slowly gathered their coats and umbrellas before disappearing into the rain-soaked Manhattan night. Silence settled again near the register after they left. The manager exhaled sharply. "You could have just comped the meal." Audrey looked at him evenly. They did not need charity. They needed dignity. Julian felt those words land somewhere deeper than he expected. The manager muttered an apology and disappeared toward the kitchen. Audrey turned to continue cleaning the counter, but Julian stepped closer before she could walk away. "You knew exactly what happened with their account," he said quietly. Audrey folded a receipt without looking up. "Patterns repeat themselves." "You talk like somebody who built the system." Audrey finally met his eyes again beneath the warm amber lights. "Maybe I did." Julian's heartbeat slowed strangely at those words. Outside, thunder rolled low above the city skyline, while reflections from passing taxis shimmered across the restaurant windows. For the first time that night, Julian Mercer realized something dangerous. Audrey Hale was not hiding from wealth. She was hiding from recognition. The restaurant finally emptied around 1 in the morning. Chairs were turned upside down onto polished tables, while the jazz music faded into soft instrumental static from hidden speakers above the bar. Rain still covered Manhattan in silver reflections outside, turning every streetlight into blurred gold across the wet pavement. Audrey stood alone near the espresso machine, counting receipts with quiet focus. Her blonde hair had loosened slightly during the shift, a few strands falling near her face as she wrote numbers into a worn black notebook. Julian Mercer remained seated at the corner booth long after everyone else had gone. His untouched whiskey had melted into amber-colored water nearly an hour ago. He did not care. His attention kept drifting toward Audrey in ways he could not fully explain. Most people became simpler the longer you observed them. Audrey Hale became more complicated. Daniel approached carefully beside the booth, holding a tablet. "Sir, your car has been waiting outside for 40 minutes. Julian barely looked at him. "Run a background search." Daniel hesitated. "On Audrey Hale." "Everything." Daniel adjusted his glasses slightly. "We already started after the Zurich mention." Julian finally looked up. "And?" Daniel lowered his voice instinctively. "Nothing." Julian frowned. "Nothing. No social media. No active investment licenses. No recent employment history before this restaurant." It is almost like she erased herself. Across the room, Audrey closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag beside an old silver watch that looked worn enough to belong to someone much older. Julian noticed how carefully she handled it. Not expensive, not fashionable, important. Daniel continued quietly. But there was one thing. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." Daniel turned the tablet toward him. A faded newspaper article filled the screen. 10 years old. The headline read, "Young financial prodigy disappears after market collapse." Beneath it was a photograph of a younger Audrey standing beside two older men in dark suits outside the New York Stock Exchange. Julian's heartbeat slowed. One of the men beside her made his chest tighten immediately. Daniel Hale. Julian recognized him instantly. His former mentor. His original business partner. The man blamed for the catastrophic financial scandal that nearly destroyed Mercer Digital Bank years ago, before disappearing from public life completely. Julian stared at the photo in silence. Audrey looked younger there, smiling slightly, confident in a way she no longer allowed herself to be. "That is impossible," Julian muttered quietly. Daniel lowered his voice further. "There is more." He zoomed in on the article. Daniel Hale had a daughter. Julian looked back toward Audrey slowly. She stood near the coffee station helping one exhausted dishwasher zip up his jacket before handing him an umbrella from the lost and found box. The young employee looked embarrassed accepting it. Audrey simply smiled and said something that made him laugh softly before leaving into the rain. Again, no performance, no audience, just kindness so natural it almost looked effortless. Julian returned his attention to the article. What happened to Daniel Hale? Daniel hesitated this time. Officially? Fraud investigation. Financial misconduct. Public disgrace. Julian's jaw tightened slightly. Officially, Daniel looked uncomfortable. Unofficially, some people inside the industry believed he was framed by members of the board during the crash. Silence settled heavily over the booth. Rain tapped steadily against the windows, while Audrey wiped down the final counter beneath warm amber light. Julian remembered Daniel Hale clearly now. Brilliant. Honest. Too honest for men like the ones who survived Wall Street. Julian slowly stood from the booth, unable to look away from Audrey anymore. Because suddenly everything about her made terrible sense. The hidden wealth. The disappearance. The distance in her eyes whenever finance was mentioned. She was not hiding from fame. She was surviving betrayal. And somewhere deep beneath the sound of rain and jazz and clinking glasses, Julian Mercer realized something else that unsettled him even more. He had built his empire on a lie someone else paid for. Julian Mercer stood motionless beneath the dim amber lights while the old newspaper article remained open on Daniel's tablet like a ghost from another lifetime. Across the restaurant, Audrey zipped her coat slowly and checked the empty dining room one final time before turning off the small candle lamps on each table. One by one, the room darkened around her. Quietly, gracefully, like someone who had spent years learning how to disappear without being noticed. Julian remembered Daniel Hale now, with painful clarity. 10 years earlier, before Mercer Digital Bank became an empire, Daniel had been the mind investors trusted most in the room. Careful, ethical, brilliant in ways that made greedy men uncomfortable. Julian had admired him once, maybe even envied him. What happened after the investigation? Julian asked quietly without looking away from Audrey. Daniel swallowed slightly. The board blamed him publicly for the collapse. Most media outlets followed the story they were given. And privately? Privately, several internal audits disappeared within 48 hours. Julian's jaw tightened harder. He knew exactly what that meant. Money could erase almost anything in Manhattan if enough powerful people agreed to forget together. Audrey walked toward the front entrance carrying the lost and found umbrella she had lent earlier to the dishwasher. Before leaving, she paused beside the piano near the corner stage. Her fingers brushed lightly across the polished black surface for barely a second. Familiar, almost affectionate. Then she reached into her bag and removed the old silver watch Julian had noticed earlier. She checked the time quietly before slipping it back onto her wrist. "Zoom in on the watch," Julian said suddenly. Daniel adjusted the tablet camera from across the room through the restaurant security feed. The silver watch appeared grainy but recognizable enough. Julian felt something strange settle into his chest the moment he saw it clearly. "That cannot be real." Daniel frowned. "What?" Julian stared at the screen. "Daniel Hale owned that watch." Silence. Rain whispered softly outside while distant thunder rolled over the city skyline. Daniel looked confused. "You are sure?" "I gave it to him." The words came out quieter than Julian expected. 10 years vanished from his memory all at once. A younger Daniel Hale laughing over coffee at 2 in the morning during endless strategy meetings. Sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, talking about building a bank people could actually trust someday. Julian had almost forgotten those nights entirely. Almost. Across the restaurant, Audrey stepped toward the door at last. Julian moved before thinking. "Wait." Audrey stopped with one hand resting lightly against the brass handle. She looked back calmly as Julian crossed the empty dining room toward her. No investors now. No audience. Just rain, silence, and the fading smell of espresso lingering in the air. "That watch," Julian said carefully. Audrey's fingers instinctively touched the silver band around her wrist. "What about it?" "It belonged to Daniel Hale." Her expression changed for the first time all night. Not fear. Something quieter. Sadness maybe. The kind carried too long. "It still does," she replied softly. Julian stopped a few feet away from her beneath the dim entrance light. "Audrey," he hesitated. "I did not know." A faint smile touched her lips then. Tired. Almost sympathetic. "That is the problem with powerful people," she said quietly. "You usually do not know whose life paid for your success." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Julian opened his mouth to respond, but Audrey gently shook her head before he could speak. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." Then she stepped outside into the rain-covered Manhattan night. Julian stood frozen near the entrance watching her disappear beneath the glowing city lights, while one impossible thought echoed louder and louder inside his mind. If Daniel Hale had been innocent all along, then somebody inside Mercer Digital Bank had destroyed the wrong man. Julian Mercer did not sleep that night. By 3 in the morning, the lights inside his penthouse office still burned against the dark Manhattan skyline, while rain crawled slowly down 40-foot windows overlooking Central Park. Files covered the massive oak desk in front of him. Audit reports, internal emails, archived financial statements from 10 years earlier. The deeper he looked, the worse the silence inside him became. Daniel Hale's name appeared everywhere during the months before the collapse. Yet something felt wrong now that Julian saw it through Audrey's eyes instead of his own ambition. Too many deleted records. Too many approvals signed by executives who quietly retired after becoming very rich. Julian loosened his tie slowly while Daniel stood near the office doorway holding another folder. "You should get some rest," Daniel said carefully. Julian did not look up. "Find me every surviving board member from the original investigation." Daniel hesitated. "Tonight. Now." His voice stayed calm. That was when people around him became nervous. Daniel nodded and disappeared without another word. Julian leaned back in his chair and stared at the old photograph lying beside his laptop. Daniel Hale stood smiling beneath the New York Stock Exchange banner with one arm around a younger Audrey. She could not have been older than 18. Bright eyes. Confident smile. No distance in her face yet. No sadness. Julian rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. "What happened to you?" he murmured quietly. Outside, thunder rolled across Manhattan again. His phone suddenly vibrated against the desk. Unknown number. Julian answered immediately. "Mercer." Silence at first. Then Audrey's voice came softly through the line. "You should stop digging." Julian sat upright instantly. "How did you get this number?" "You own half the city. Your number is not difficult to find." He almost smiled despite himself. "Almost. Where are you?" "That is not important." Rain crackled faintly through the phone line around her. She sounded outside somewhere. "Alone." "You already know enough." Audrey continued quietly. Leave the past where it is. Julian looked back at Daniel Hale's photograph. Your father was innocent. Silence answered him this time, long enough that he wondered if she had ended the call. Then finally, very softly, she spoke again. Innocent people still lose every day, Mr. Mercer. The words carried no bitterness. That somehow hurt more. Julian stood and walked toward the giant windows overlooking the sleeping city below. Why work in that restaurant? He asked quietly. With your money, you could disappear anywhere. Audrey exhaled softly on the other end of the line. Because my father loved that place. Julian frowned slightly. Audrey continued before he could speak. Before Wall Street. Before banks. Before investors. He used to play piano there on weekends when nobody knew his name. Julian closed his eyes briefly. He remembered that too now. Daniel laughing. Beside an old piano during company Christmas parties years ago. Simpler days. Honest days. The owners were going to lose the building after the pandemic, Audrey said softly. So I stayed. Julian looked down at the city lights reflecting across the glass. You saved the restaurant. No, Audrey corrected gently. I protected a memory. Silence settled between them again. Not uncomfortable this time. Just heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Then Audrey's voice lowered slightly. There are people inside your company who know exactly what happened to my father. Julian's expression hardened immediately. Names. Be careful, she whispered instead. Men who bury the truth rarely stop after one grave. Before Julian could answer, the line disconnected. He remained standing beside the window long after the call ended, staring out over Manhattan while one realization settled cold and sharp inside his chest. Audrey Hale had not contacted him to ask for revenge. She had called to warn him. By sunrise, Julian Mercer had not changed clothes once. Manhattan slowly brightened beyond the glass walls of his penthouse, while coffee sat untouched beside stacks of financial records spread across the table like pieces of a broken confession. The city looked peaceful from 40 stories above the streets. It was a lie. Julian knew that now. Daniel entered quietly carrying another file box just after 6:30 in the morning. I found something, he said carefully. Julian looked up immediately. Daniel placed an old internal audit report onto the desk. Most of the pages were marked confidential. Several signatures had been blacked out years earlier. But one name remained visible beneath the deleted approvals. Victor Langford. Julian's expression darkened instantly. Victor Langford had served on Mercer Digital Bank's executive board for over 15 years. Publicly respected. Quietly feared. The kind of man who smiled during charity galas while destroying competitors behind closed doors. Daniel swallowed uneasily. There is more. He slid forward another document. 3 months after Daniel Hale was blamed for the collapse, Langford transferred $200 million into offshore accounts connected to shell companies in Zurich. Silence filled the office. Julian stared at the papers while Audrey's voice echoed in his mind again. Men who bury the truth rarely stop after one grave. Slowly, Julian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For 10 years he had believed the official story because believing it had been easier than questioning the machine that made him powerful. Easier than admitting someone good may have been sacrificed so the company could survive. His phone buzzed suddenly across the desk. Another unknown number. Julian answered instantly. Mercer, you did not stop digging. Audrey's voice sounded tired this time. Softer somehow. Julian walked toward the windows overlooking Central Park below. Morning rain still clung to the glass. Victor Langford, he said quietly. Silence answered him for several seconds. Then Audrey exhaled slowly. I hoped you would never say that name. Julian turned toward the city skyline. You knew? My father knew too. Her voice remained calm, but Julian could hear the weight beneath it now. Years of silence compressed into a few careful words. He found evidence before the collapse. He wanted to expose the board. Julian's throat tightened slightly, and they blamed him instead. Yes. Somewhere on Audrey's end, a subway train rumbled faintly in the distance. Real life. Ordinary sounds. Strange how the woman connected to hundreds of millions still traveled through the city like everyone else. Why did you never come forward? Julian asked quietly. Audrey laughed once under her breath. Not bitter. Just tired. Against billionaires? Against lawyers? Against news networks they controlled. She paused. People believe money faster than truth. Julian lowered his eyes toward the audit files spread across his desk. She was right. He had believed it too. What happens now? He asked finally. Silence stretched again before Audrey answered. Nothing. Julian frowned immediately. Nothing. My father is gone. Exposing them will not bring him back. But they destroyed him. Audrey's voice softened then in a way that unsettled him more than anger would have. And if I become obsessed with revenge, they destroy me too. Julian stood completely still beside the rain-covered windows. In all his years surrounded by powerful people, he had never heard anyone speak about pain with that kind of grace. No screaming, no bitterness, just quiet truth. Audrey continued softly. I stayed alive because I learned something my father never did. What? Julian asked. Her answer came almost like a whisper. The world only respects power until somebody chooses peace instead. The line disconnected gently after that. Julian remained alone inside the silent office while morning light slowly filled the room around him. On the desk beside the audit reports sat the old photograph of Daniel Hale, smiling beside his daughter outside the New York Stock Exchange. Julian looked at it for a long moment before finally understanding the thing that had unsettled him most about Audrey Hale from the very beginning. She had every reason to hate the world that betrayed her, but somehow she never let it make her cruel.